to get us up to speed again, just to refresh our minds. We finished the Sermon on the Mount last week, but I believe that Matthew 8 is kind of it's not a continuation because it's not still Jesus' sermon, but as Matthew is writing this book, I believe he is writing Matthew chapter 8 really as a supporting statement to Jesus' last statements in the Sermon on the Mount. And so last week we looked at Jesus' final statements in that. We looked at this talk that he was giving about the possibility of building a home or building our life upon the rock. It was a call of action for us. It was this place where there is stability, where you can stand in the storm. It's a place of strength. It's not on shaky foundations, because there's this other possibility of building our home or building our life on top of sand and on top of shaky foundations, on top of a place where when everything goes crazy, when the storm gets here, when winds are blowing, when rain's coming down and all of those things, that our house has the potential to not stand. And they very likely won't stand. Like Jesus says, it will fall and great will be its fall. But he says that there's this other thing. He talks about this rock, and we looked at how it's obedience, how Jesus says, I'm telling you all of these things, I'm teaching you all of these things, I'm exemplifying for you all of these things. And if you listen and if you see and if you hear with the things that I'm telling you and you actually do them, you'll be on the rock. You'll be on this place that when all the stuff starts happening, it doesn't say the storm's going to go away, but it says that you'll stand. And that's an important thing to realize, because we're going to see a contrast there. Well, I probably won't hit on that too hard, but in our passage today, a storm comes and Jesus takes the storm away. Last week he was talking about the storm comes, it doesn't go away, but you still stand. It can happen both ways. So like I said, we talked about all of these things, all of these different lessons that Jesus was giving us all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. He talked about how we can be living on a stable foundation. And that's the understanding that we left with last week. But we come into chapter 8. We just moved past the Sermon on the Mount. Like I said, maybe you looked at the screen and it usually says verses. It says chapter 8. And like, that seems crazy. I thought, I was like, that's kind of crazy. Like, there's 43 verses, I think, in this chapter. Or no, wait, 34 verses. I got that backwards there. But there's 34 verses in this chapter. It's like, how in the world are we going to get through this? But we're going to. And I think there's a good reason why. Like, we could break this into a bunch of chunks. We could take it over a lot of different weeks. But my concern is that if we do that, we will miss the big point that Matthew is making through all of these statements in this chapter. And I want to see the big point. I don't want to miss the big point by breaking out and seeing all the little tiny points, because the big point's really important. So we're going to go through chapter 8. And, this might seem a little crazy. I'm going to read it, so bear with me, and let's follow through this entire chapter of Matthew 8. I think sometimes it's good to take a big chunk. So starting in verse 1, Matthew 8. It says, when he had come down from the mountain, it's obviously Sermon on the Mount just finished. When he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him, and behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way. Show yourself to the priests. Offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does this. And Jesus heard it, and he marveled, and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go your way. As you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. And when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. He cast out the spirits with a word. He healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. And when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. And when a certain scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then another of his disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead. Now when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him, and suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. Then the disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. But he said to them, Why are you so fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him? When he had come to the other side, to the country of Gergesenes, something like that, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time? Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine feeding, so the demons begged him, saying, If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. And he said to them, Go. So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. Then those who kept them fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. It's a lot. And you're wondering, how in the world does this all connect to a big point? We're going to see that. But it is a lot. Like I said, I see chapter 8 of Matthew as kind of like Matthew adding his own exclamation point onto the end of Jesus' sermon. So we're going to deal with this, and we're going to see, I believe, how it gets there. But in the first, like I said, there's a lot, so we're probably not going to be going all over the place. We're kind of just going to, sit in Matthew 8 and deal with all of this passage. The first 17 verses of Matthew 8. In the first 17 verses, we see Jesus obviously just came down off the mountain. Matthew's giving us these records of him engaging with people. And this time he's engaging with people that are sick, that are hurting, that are injured, things like that, things that are physically going on with people. There's this first person, this man that comes to Jesus. And this first man that we see is a guy with leprosy. And he comes to Jesus. And leprosy was a disease that you hear about quite a bit in the Bible. And you still hear about it in other parts of the world. We don't hear about it much in first world countries anymore because it's completely curable medically now. But back then it wasn't. It was completely incurable at this time in history. And it's interesting, like I said, there was no known cure for it. And it's interesting when you look at something like leprosy, because like I said, the Bible's been dealing, all through the Old Testament, there's a lot of accounts of leprosy and how it was dealt with. And it's kind of interesting for us, I guess, even thinking about this guy right now, because we're right at a time in history right now where we're still not all the way through it, but of a major infectious disease sweeping through the world. And for us, to me, it kind of brought back just memory of this time, because there's accounts in the Bible where it talks about dealing with leprosy in very much the same way that we were prescribed to deal with COVID. If you go back to the book of Leviticus and Leviticus 13, it's so interesting. In Leviticus 13, it gives an account that literally says that when there's an infection with leprosy, it says to cover the lower half of your face. It says to inform people of your infection and to keep distance from them. That is what it says in Leviticus 13 in talking about an infectious disease. And it's like, we just came through this time and we're not all the way through it yet, where we're dealing with this infectious disease. So I see this guy, it's like, man, like, and this is like a whole thing that's like, it'd be terrible to deal with. Like, thankfully for us, this would be you can deal with this right now, but you couldn't then. Like, even like in the early days of COVID, we had no idea, couldn't deal with it. It's like, we didn't know what was going on with it, but we had to take steps. And these people for leprosy, they're having to take all of these steps, and it's terrible. It's all these things. And this guy is coming to Jesus. He's like, there is no way for me to be cured. There's no hope in this at all. And he comes to Jesus. And I love what he says to Jesus. He says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. It's not like, could you? Like, maybe? Like, and it's not like we go to the Lord and demand things of him. He wasn't demanding things of him. He just says, if it's your will, really is what he's saying. If you're willing, if it is your will, you can do this. I absolutely believe that you can. That's how this man approached Jesus. And like I said, it wasn't a demand. It wasn't just sometimes like it wasn't an entitled expectation, like I deserve this. He's just like, if you're willing, I know you can do this. That's how he approached the Lord. I think that's a good way to approach the Lord. Because he's like I said, this guy, he was facing this thing that, a lot of times people lived a long time with leprosy. We don't know how long this guy had it. It's like super degenerative. It attacks your nervous system, your eyes, your skin, like all types of aspects of your body. It just degenerates it, and it like makes your skin fall off and your eyes start going really bad. And like it was pretty much like, the mortality rate on it was almost entire, like probably like nearly 100%. Like I don't know the exact numbers, but there was no cure for it. So this guy's only hope was coming to Jesus. And he didn't demand anything to Jesus. He says, if you're willing. And Jesus is like, I am willing. Like, I'm willing. Be cleansed. I mean, it's such an interesting thing in looking at that. Because obviously, there was no cure for this. He came to Jesus and asked Jesus if he's willing. And Jesus says, I'm willing. Be cleansed. And this is like where we're talking about. We sang in the end of that song that says, I bow before the Lord of Lords. This is when you see Lord of Lords at work. This is when the Lord of Lords speaks. He speaks into the life of this man. Like he speaks really like towards an illness. Like he's talking like to the man, to the leprosy, and it just listens. It's like Jesus spoke and leprosy listened. Like leprosy left the room when Jesus spoke. Like that's the Lord of Lords. There's nobody else. There is nothing else who could speak but a word, and a disease listens to the word. Like this is him. This is only him. An incurable disease was cured in a moment because the Lord of Lords spoke. That's all he did. He didn't go through all of these things. He spoke, and it happened. It continues on in kind of the same vein of thinking. And in verses 5 and 6, we see Jesus, he arrives in the town of Capernaum. Capernaum was like a little seaside village, kind of has a little, like a marina there where the boats are going out from. But he gets to this place called Capernaum. In 5 and 6, it says, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. I love this guy's conversation with Jesus too. Like, he's a Roman centurion. The guy had power. He had respect. He had soldiers under him. He had servants in his household. All of these things. This wasn't one of us, just your average person, just like coming in. It's like, this guy, he was somebody. Like, he was somebody. And he's coming, but he was somebody that was coming to the Lord of Lords. And he knew his place. Like you see in his conversation, he knew his place in this conversation. And like I said, first of all, like I have respect for this guy because, like I said, he was noteworthy. He has power. He has influence. He's actually coming for help. I think a lot of times pride stops us from pursuing help. Like we're too prideful about something that's like, I'm gonna deal with this. We're gonna figure it out. Like there's help available. There's people that love and people care and people will come around side, but it's like, no, like I can't let anybody know about this. I'm just gonna deal with it. That's pride. This guy is like, big guy coming to the Lord of Lords. No pride. And he's not even coming for himself. He's not even coming to ask something selfishly for him, like, Lord, I need healing. He's like, there's a servant in my household that needs healing. I need you to heal him. And Jesus is like, yeah, I will come heal him. I'll go do that. Like Jesus is like, I'll come heal him. But then again, I love this man's response again, because like Jesus is like, yeah, he says in verse 7, I will come and heal him. But then the centurion, he kind of recoils back a little bit. He's like, whoa, Jesus, like, I know who you are. I am not worthy to have you walk into my house. Like, I'm not worthy of that. Like I said, he's a big guy, but he sees his lowly home in light of the Lord of Lords. And then he makes an incredible statement. He's like, I know. He's like, I know who you are. Like, you can't come to my house. Like, my house isn't good enough for you. But he's like, but I know if you just speak a word, it'll be done. Because I know who you are. I know who we're dealing with here. He says, I know that if you just speak a word, that my servant will be healed right now. It's his conversation with Jesus. He's like, he starts talking to Jesus. He's like, I have some authority too. He's like, in my household, I have soldiers. If I tell them to go, they go. He's like, if I tell them to come, they come. If I tell them to do this or do that, they do it. Because I have the authority over these people. But he was saying those things because he was reflecting on, like, I have some authority, but I recognize your authority and how much greater your authority is. He recognized Jesus' authority as God. And he was like, if you just speak, it will be done. Like, you spoke and the world came into existence. If you speak, this sickness can go away. Jesus marveled at this man's faith. Verses 10 to 12, that whole section, he marvels at this man's faith. The reality was that what this man had was an uncommon faith at that moment. And he was in the midst, in an area of people that should have known, that had everything told to them of like, that he's coming. Like what to expect, what to look for. He's here, and people weren't seeing it. And this man comes, and he's not even of this people group. And it was such an uncommon faith at that time. Jesus is like, I've looked all through Israel and I haven't even seen someone that has this much faith, and he's not even part of Israel. He wasn't even, his family didn't come down through generations of hearing about the Messiah coming, but he knows who he's dealing with. And Jesus is like, a lot of these people in this nation, unfortunately, they're not going to know me. He's like, they're not going to be in my kingdom. And Jesus says, like, there's going to be people coming from the east and from the west, and they will be part of my kingdom. And thankfully for us, because that's kind of talking about us. We are to the east of where this happened. Actually, wait. No, sorry, we're to the west. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, the world goes around, so you can go either way. So, failed there in the geographic point. But you can go either way and get to us. And thankfully for us, the point was made, the plan was there. I've had people come and ask that before. Like someone at one time was really concerned because they're like, does the Bible ever say, like, where, besides, because they came and their exact question was, besides for Paul, does the Bible ever say that a non-Jewish person can be saved? And I was like, yeah, it says it all over the place. It's not even just in the New Testament, it's all through the Old Testament. Like, you go to the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah talks about how, like, the God's house will be a house of prayer for many nations. You go into Psalms, and it talks about, like, the city of Zion and how people from all nations are coming to the house of God. Like, you come to, like, in the book of Hebrews, and it talks about, or in Revelation, it talks about all nations, all peoples from everywhere gathering around to worship at the throne of God. Like, it's everywhere. And thankfully for us, it is, because we weren't born into that nation. And Jesus is like looking at this guy, he's like, you believe. Like, you didn't even have all of this stuff, but you have real faith. Like I said, a man of human power coming and humble before him who has all of the power. It's incredible to see. Jesus finishes his conversation with this centurion, and the last point in this conversation is in verse 13. Jesus said to the centurion, he says, "Go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you." And his servant was healed that same hour. And it's crazy to see this because Jesus didn't end up going to this man's house. I know Jesus would have had no problem going to his house. He said that was his first response. Like, yeah, I'll come. I'll come and deal with it. But the guy's like, you don't have to do that. Just speak. Jesus didn't end up going to this man's house because he didn't have to go, because yes, he does have that power. He was willing to go, but as this man asked for, Jesus just spoke. And it happened. The man's servant was healed. And then there's a continuing account of more that Jesus was doing. In verses 14 through 17, we see him healing all kinds of sickness. We even see him heal Peter's mother-in-law. And we know that she lived in that city. She lived in the city of Capernaum. And there was other people that were involved with Jesus. And Capernaum, I believe, ends up becoming more of kind of like the base of operations for like the disciples and Jesus. They kind of came back here and traveled out places all the time. And Jesus did stay at some places in this city. But like I said, Peter's mother-in-law was there. And sometimes we forget that. It's like there's this view of the disciples like they aren't regular people. Like they're regular people with families. Like Peter was married. Like this obviously tells us that Peter was married. Peter was doing all this stuff, getting into trouble, getting jailed, trying to chop people's ears off, following Jesus, sinking into the water because Jesus told him to walk on all of these things. But he's married, he has family, he has all of these things, but he's still following Jesus seriously into crazy situations. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that. But Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And Jesus starts healing all of these other people. And through all of this section, all these first verses of Matthew 8, again, we begin to see the power of Jesus' word. We get to see the power and the authority of the Lord of Lords. We see here through all of these verses that he is the authority and the power over disease and sickness and life and death. He has that power. And we're going to skip one little section because we're going to circle back to it. But we're going to jump forward to verses 23 through 27. So we talked about all the disease and sickness, and then we get to 23 through 27, and it says, "Now when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with waves, but he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?' Then he arose, and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, 'Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?'" Jesus and the disciples, they obviously finish the sermon, healing all these people. The crowds are gathering. Jesus let's jump on the boat. Let's get out on the sea. And we don't know. We don't know what the weather was like when they got in the boat. We don't know what the situation was like when they boarded it and they headed out. But what we know is that here at this moment, they're out on the sea. And they're out on the sea in this boat, and it says a great tempest arose on this sea. It means a really severe storm. It says in those verses, it says that the boat was literally getting covered with the waves. The waves were coming into the boat. Waves coming into the boat's not a good thing. You don't want the water in the boat. Now, some modern boats, how they're made, there's little vents and little ports where water can run off the surface, but because there's a hole and there's things underneath that are still ballasting the boat up. But back then it's it's probably just a shell of a boat, and water coming into that's not what you want. You're gonna sink. And so there's water coming into the boat, and through all of this, verse 24 tells us that Jesus was on the boat and he was sleeping right through it. The storms are raging, and Jesus is sleeping right through it. Jesus is sleeping through the waves coming onto the boat. He's sleeping right through the middle of the storm. He's sleeping through all of these guys now probably panicking and trying to figure out the situation, and they're trying to deal with it, and they're scared. They think they're going to die, and crazy thing, it's an interesting situation. Jesus is there sleeping on the boat through all of this. But eventually, like the disciples, they're at their breaking point. And we read that there, and we see that eventually they went and they wake Jesus up. But we have to remember something. We have to remember something about these men too. Again, real men, real lives, even real careers prior to following Jesus. Several of these guys were fishermen that actively, regularly fished on this sea. Like this was not unfamiliar territory to them. Like Jesus literally went and called some of them off of their boats, off of the job to come follow him. They were not unfamiliar with this territory. Whatever kind of storm this was that they were caught up in, it must not have been some small thing, because these were men, several of them. I mean, you have, Matthew there, he's a tax collector. It's probably not, familiar territory for him. But you get to some of these other guys, they're fishermen. They're lifelong fishermen. They grew up in it. They grew up on this sea. This must have been really, really bad, because if these guys were shaken up and this boat was taken on water, this storm was so bad that these guys literally thought they were about to die. Like when you're comfortable with something and you're at the point of like, we're going to die. This is bad. Like it must be really bad. So they wake Jesus up. They wake Jesus up, and in verse 26, Jesus says, "Why are you guys so fearful, O you of little faith?" Well, they're like, "You're sleeping. We're dying." But you pay attention to this and you see what happens. Again, you see the Lord of Lords. They wake Jesus up. Jesus gets up. He stands up. He's in the boat. Jesus literally verbally rebukes the storm. Think about even being in that situation. It's like, we're dying, like this is a storm, like the waves, the sea, like we know he's powerful, but Jesus is like, talks to the storm. Storm stops. Like that's crazy. Like, and again, you get to the point where these guys, they marvel at this. Verse 27, it says, "Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Who can this be? Jesus spoke. He rebuked. Like the very systems of nature listened to his word. He spoke and the storm stopped. It's crazy. And we keep moving. And it's like there's like situation to situation. Then you get to verses 28 and 29. Another interesting situation. And it says, when they came to the other side, like they just thought they were about to die on this sea, but then they get to the other side of the sea. And when they get there, they run into, verse 28 and 29, it says, when they come to the other side, to the country of Gergesenes, there met Jesus, 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass by. And suddenly they cried out, saying, "What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" And it's kind of an interesting thing to actually see this engagement here. We see how Jesus initially engages with these men in these verses. Like Jesus hadn't done anything. Obviously, they're just walking through this area and these guys meet them there. It says like people weren't able to pass by this road because these guys were acting crazy. I don't know if they're attacking people. I don't know. It just says that they were exceedingly fierce. And then Jesus comes walking up the road. And they start talking to him. Like there may be a bit more conversation, but there's no record here of Jesus's like words or conversation with these men. Like it's like a one-sided conversation. So they start talking to Jesus. But you see how they're responding. You see their initial impressions of like, whoa, like what do you have to do with us? Like, why are you here? Like, are you here to torment us? Like these are demons. It's like they're the ones that are supposed to be doing the tormenting. And then but the Lord of Lords is walking up the road and they're like, whoa, like they're stopped in their tracks now. For us, it's even a there's a biblical and there's also a scientific reality that darkness flees in the presence of light. And darkness can't stay in the presence of light. And so as the light, as the Son, the light of the world, as the Lord of Lords, as the Son of God is walking up this road, darkness is afraid because the light is advancing on them. But Jesus isn't talking. There's evil inside of them. They're recoiling at the very presence of Jesus. Like evil becomes uncomfortable because Jesus is here. These demons, when Jesus gets there, they're like, oh no, this is the very Son of God. Have you come here to torment us? And I said, notice Jesus doesn't say anything. He lets them keep talking. Or at least Matthew didn't record Jesus saying anything. But they're kind of uncomfortable and they're rambling. And you get to verse 31. And in verse 31 it says, so the demons begged him. They begged Jesus, saying, if you cast us out, permit us to go away into this herd of swine or this herd of pigs. And that's a really telling statement. Because it wasn't like the demons were like, well, if you manage to cast us out, like we'll go over to those pigs. Like it's not like if you're strong enough to cast us out, then we'll figure this out afterwards. Or if you even try to cast us out, like no, they know who they're dealing with. They know the authority that's on the road in front of them at that moment. They said, if you cast us out, that's completely his decision. That's not them. That's not their ability to stop it. Like, it's completely his decision. It's like, if you decide to cast us out. Like, they know. Like, we got no say in this matter. If you decide to cast us out, let us go into these pigs. They knew exactly the gravity of Jesus' word. They knew that it was his choice in this situation to do whatever he wanted to do in this situation. In this entire section of verses at the end of this chapter, there's only recorded one word that Jesus says. When they ask, if you cast us out, permit us to go away into this herd of swine. And it says, and he said to them, go. And they went. These demons run off into a herd of pigs, then they run over a cliff and they end up in the sea and they die. That's what happens here. Jesus spoke even just one word. The demons listened and obeyed that one word. Like I said, I promise you, this is all going to come to a really specific point. Like I said, we skipped some verses, and I want to circle back to verses 18 through 22. We've seen Jesus engage the diseases and the sickness. We've seen him engage the storm. We've seen him engage these demons. And we go back to 18 through 22. So, chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. And it says, and when Jesus saw the great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came to him and said, teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Then another of his disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, follow me. Let the dead bury their own dead. Jesus says these things. These verses happen right before they set off on the boat. These are people that are coming up to Jesus, like right up on the shore. He's on this, they're heading towards the boat. These are people trying to talk to him. People saying, I want to follow you, Jesus. I want to do these things. Jesus is responding to them. When Jesus responds to these guys, he gives them kind of a reality check. And this is the thing, like, I don't think we reality check a lot, even in the pursuit of the church and in talking to other people and in talking about what it means to follow Jesus and talking about, like, coming to know Jesus and being a Christian. Like, a lot of times we don't have this reality check. And we've talked about this in previous weeks. But this first guy comes to Jesus and, like, he's like, I want to follow you. Jesus announces essentially to him that he's basically homeless. He's like, even the animals have a place to live. I don't. He's like, you really want that? You really want that? Like, that's where I'm at. He said, I don't have anywhere to lay my head. Jesus was warning this man that really following him might come with some uncomfortable circumstances. He was telling this man that, he might not get or he might not have or he might not keep if he already has the things of this world that bring him comfort. if he's really going to commit to following Jesus for real. It's like, if this is for real, if you're really going to follow me, this is where I'm at. If you really want to follow me down here, then you might be in some places where I'm at. Like, I'm going without. Like, following me is following me. It's not everything else. It's a one-way track. Jesus makes this comment in Matthew 8 because his way, like I said, doesn't necessarily lead to the stuff. It probably doesn't. That's the reality. Jesus used an extreme example here that, it might not even lead to a place to permanently lay your head. Jesus wanted this guy to be aware of what he was committing to. Like, do you really want to commit to this? Like, if this is the reality, do you still want it? Like, if it comes with hard things, do you still want it? Or do you just want it if it's easy? It's like, do you just want to be associated with it? Do you just like I have some popularity. People are, like, my name is getting known. Do you just want to be attached to that? Or do you want what this really is? That's what Jesus was challenging this guy with. And Jesus talks to this other guy, and this other guy says, Lord, let me first go bury my father. And the wording in this likely is kind of misunderstood in our language right now. Because this wasn't likely talking about a man whose father had already died and he just needs to go bury him. That really isn't how the makeup of this phrasing is. It's more likely that this statement leads towards, like, I'm going to go be with my family. I'm going to spend this time with my family. I'm going to stay with my family until my father passes away. And when my father passes away, then I will come follow you. So, like, I need this time. Like, I'm going to spend this time with my family. Like, this is what I want. This is what I need and all these things. But when that day comes, then I will follow you at that point. That's more likely what it means here. But we think about that, and that's when we talk about following Jesus, that's kind of a slippery slope. Because there's always going to be the next thing to wait for. It's like, it's great to have our time with the family. We value that. We do those things. And, and Jesus is even clear in other parts of Scripture that's less like, the call may be for you to leave your family. Like, if my call is somewhere completely different, are you willing? And so for this guy, I said there's always something that we can put in front of following Jesus, whether it be my family, whether it be like, getting the job and the education and everything worked out first, whether it be, getting all my finances perfectly in order first, whether it be like I'm going to get to a place where I'm finally comfortable and satisfied in life and then I will follow you. But again, like when we're talking about what we're talking about today, that kind of is a really defined like lack of understanding of who he is, because he's Lord of Lords. And he's not Lord of Lords that deserves, I'll get to you eventually. He's Lord of Lords right now. When he says follow, that's something to take really seriously. Jesus like, you can follow me. But he's like, I'm going to go I need to go live this part of my life first, and I will come follow you. Jesus like, follow me now. It's not to say that there won't be aspects of engaging with all of those things in the course of following Jesus, but the turn to following him is now, not I will plan to do it later, because that's not taking him that seriously. I said, when we get to understand who he is, when we see that he is Lord, that he is God, that he is Savior, he is the one that came down to save me from my sin. Like, do we really think that we could work all these things out well without him anyways? Like, do we really think that we can find that satisfaction that we're craving apart from him? I mean, a lot of us are really convinced that we can. But the reality is, and even Scripture talks about it, is that, like, there's like a longing in a person's soul for something more than what they know in life without Christ. And we try to fill that with everything else. Like, you'll try to fill that with all of the grains of sand that you can try to build your house on. Talked about that last week. Like, we're longing for something more. That longing will only be filled right with him. Our soul longs for him, even if we don't know it yet. It does. But we'll try to find it in everything else. But we take Jesus' lesson from all of this, and we have to understand that there is a cost to following him. Jesus talks about counting the cost. For us, the lesson here now is that Jesus was never afraid to give the honest account of what it meant to follow him. And I think far too much like Christian culture and far too much church is this push to like it's good enough just to be associated with him. Like, you know, it's just about like the social gathering of people into a building. But it's not about follow the Lord of Lords. It's not about follow Jesus. The crazy thing is Jesus actually discouraged people from fake following him. Like we've started all of these things in these ways and these things where it's like, are we encouraging people to kind of just the facade of following Jesus? Like are we ending up with Jesus has dealt with it the whole Sermon on the Mount, actors and hypocrites? Like, that's not what we're supposed to be. Like, Jesus wasn't afraid of saying that this is more difficult. Do you really want it? Like, we need to talk about it like that too. He's still talking about it. This isn't the first time that he's dealt with it like this. Like for us, I said, I don't want any of us to be playing the part. I want us to truly follow him. That's what Jesus is calling for here. And so we've gone through like this whole chapter. Like we just dealt with it again. We just circled back to that point of Jesus saying this isn't going to be easy. But Matthew's making a point through this whole thing of who we're dealing with. We see through this whole chapter, we've seen all of these various points and these various circumstances. And he asks again, why did we go through the whole thing? And how is this the exclamation point that I described at the beginning? So Jesus told us last week that the only rock, the only solid foundation to build our life on top of is to listen to everything that he says and actually do it. He's like, you want to be considered wise? You want to be able to stand when the storm gets here? You want to be founded and built on the rock? Then listen to me. Listen to what I have to say and follow me. That's what he said in the last part of chapter 7. But then Matthew comes into chapter 8, which we read the whole thing of. Matthew comes into chapter 8, and Matthew takes Jesus' point of listening to and obeying him, because that's what Jesus just talked about. And he's like, look, even Jesus spoke to the disease, to illness. He spoke into that situation. And even disease and illness listened to him. Jesus was out on a boat in the storm, and Jesus spoke to the storm and the waves and the wind, and it listened to him. Jesus talked to demons. It didn't even have a long conversation. It was just one word. And they listened to him. Yes, his path isn't easy. Yes, it will cost us some things. Jesus told us to listen and obey him. He told us to follow him. So really the simple question for us today is, and it took the whole chapter to get here, but obviously everything else does listen to him. But will we listen to what he has to say and obey him? Will we follow Jesus? Verse 27 again, just that one thing. It's the disciples, they were marveling and said, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? And we can be like, who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him? We can add to that, like, who can this be that even like sickness, disease, death, and life obey him? Who can this be that even the demons obey him? For us, we know who he is. His name is Jesus. He is, Bible definitively calls him the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is God who came down as a man. He has called us to follow him. But if we don't understand the gravity of who he is, I'm afraid that we won't follow him. Like when we see his greatness and his majesty, when we see like everything in this world cowers before him and listens to him. It's like, man, like shouldn't we be listening to him too? Like shouldn't we take this with such a level of seriousness that this isn't just a storybook? These aren't just words on a page. This is God's word explaining God's greatness, explaining God's call for us as little people, his creation, to follow him. Like I said, we went through this whole chapter Because we're not going to follow him on accident. We can try to fake it, but obviously, as we've seen through the whole Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will know. We might not. He might be pretty good at it. He'll know. Don't do it. As we sit here today, Matthew is showing us that like everything in every aspect of creation listens to his word and obeys him. So really, like, shouldn't we obey him too? I believe that we should. I believe that we must. I believe everything in eternity is hinged on us listening to and obeying the word of the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. Let's pray.